Welcome, everyone. We are very, very thrilled and extremely happy and honored, of course, to have Shereen Abouelnaga among us today, presenting on a very, very thought-provoking and very interesting topic. I am Niveen El-Nassery, the director of the Middle East Studies program, and I'm joining you today online since I have like a small accident that happened to me a few weeks ago, and I'm like staying home most of the time and teaching on Zoom. So uh, at least we have Zoom now. So it's it's a pleasure having you, Shireen, among us today, as I said, and we are very thankful to all the audience in person and also in Zoom. I think that people are going to continue coming within a few minutes. So I just wanted to remind you all that, of course, and today also Hanan El-Alawi from Gender and Women Studies is joining us. She's a visiting assistant professor in the department, as I said, of Gender and Women Studies at UW-Madison, and she will be presenting Shereen Abouelnaga today. So I just want to remind you all that we have, many events coming up this fall and also in the spring. We have a big international conference that will take place in April, April 17. It will be actually a hybrid conference, so I encourage you all to attend the conference, but also if you would like to present, it will the topic of the conference is on the US and the Middle East relations. So as we might imagine, there's a lot to say about that. So we are going to tackle this very important topic from different perspectives, politics, culture manifestations, and also art and artistic expressions. So I invite you all to check our website, and if you are interested, please send us your abstract so you can participate in one of the panels, or if you would like also to be present at the meeting in person or on Zoom. And again, the conference in April will be a hybrid format, meaning that we will have people coming in person, but also presenters and audience can join us on Zoom. So please check our website. We have many, many other talks and lectures and some cultural manifestations that will be happening this fall. So please, I don't want to take much time, but check our website so you can see all the events happening within the Middle East Studies program. So thank you very much all for joining us. We have so many people joining on Zoom and also in person. As we all know, Shireen is a very well-known intellectual and professor in the Middle East and of course abroad. So without further ado, I will give the mic to Hanan so she can present her. And for all the attendees, you are able to, of course, Shireen will have like 35, 40 minutes to do her presentation, and then we will open the floor to the Q&A. You are welcome to just unmute yourself and ask your question, or if you would like also to write your comment or question in the chat space, and we will be able to read your question. We will try to finish around 1:15. Of course, you are welcome. I know that some people would have to leave at 1, so don't feel, feel free to leave whenever you have to. So thank you very much all, and once again we all welcome Shereen Abouelnaga, and we welcome also especially Hanan El-Alawi.
Thank you so much, Dr. Niveen, for that lovely introduction, your introduction of the Middle East Studies program. and this series of wonderful illuminating lectures. I'm so happy to be in this room with you today, folks. I reiterate what Dr. Naveen said. My name is Hanan Al-Alawi, and I am a visiting assistant professor at the Gender and Women's Department at UW-Madison. And I'm honored today to moderate this talk by Professor Shereen Abouelnaga. I'm going to start with a short bio. So Professor Shereen Abouelnaga is a professor of English and comparative literature at Cairo University. She has published critical and literary articles in cultural and literary journals with a special focus on gender. Her Arabic books include A Passion of Difference, Readings in Selected Feminist Texts, published in 1997, Feminist or Womanist, published in 2001, Nation and the Narration of Arab Women Writers in 2003, and Intellectuals in the Transnational Phase, 2014. She was on the jury committee of several awards, including the Naguib Mahfouz Medal Award organized by AUC. And in 2016, she published Women in Revolutionary Egypt, Gender and the New Geographies of Identity. Her recent book, which was published in Arabic very recently in 2014, is titled The World's Womb, Transnational Motherhood, which is a very compelling topic. Aware of her position in the third world, Abouelnaga views the world from the lens of a socialist feminist. So socialist feminism is at the crux of her framework and her approach to literature and to culture. And she is concerned with reading the manifestations of neo-patriarchy and neoliberalism that precipitate the rise of the new text, what she calls the new text, a powerful sign of decolonial resistance. And today's talk is titled Cross-Stitching the Scattered Women's Literary Subjectivities. And I'm just going to say a few lines about that. So Professor Abouelnaga looks at how women writers create their sense of self through stories that are often broken, layered, and full of contradictions. And she uses cross-stitching, both as a craft and a metaphor, to show how women piece together identity, memory, and voice across time and space. So in this way, she views women's cross-stitching and, by extension, writing, not just as a personal testimony, but as a political act that reclaims the power to tell stories from the margins. So without further ado, Professor Shereen Abouelnaga, welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Good evening, everybody, or good afternoon, depends where you are. Let me start by thanking the Middle East Studies Program for this invitation. And Hanan Al-Alawi, thank you very much for your kind words and for taking the time to do this. I also want to wish Professor Naveen Al-Nusayri a speedy recovery. You're on my thoughts all the time, and I hope you'll be soon feeling better. And thanks, of course, for showing up in the Zoom at least. Let me share my PowerPoint. Okay. Yeah. Okay. So as you can see, the title is Cross-Stitching the Scattered Women's Literary Subjectivity. Now, let me begin by reading a poem. I don't know why it doesn't move. Yes. A small striped sleeve in her lap, navy and white. Needles carefully whipping in yarn from two sides. She reminds me of the wide-angled women filled with calm I pretended I was related to in crowds. Her silver hook dips gracefully. And when is the last time you saw anyone sew a pocket onto a gray linen shirt in public? Her stitches must be invisible. A bevel thimble glitters in the light. but a grave separateness has invaded the world. They sip with eyes shut and never say amazing or look at us or may your thread never break. This is, of course, a poem by Naomi Shihab Nye, and it's called Sewing, Knitting, Crocheting. And the poem offers more than an image, it offers a philosophy. In the quiet act of stitching, Nye locates serenity, community, and unspoken resilience. This reclamation of the textile craft as a site of relational knowing becomes the foundation for a rational approach to women's subjectivities, showing how fragmented selves might be afforded coherence and care through the metaphor of stitching. I am writing a book about sewing and embroidery as a feminist means of joining the scattered, the fragmented, and the torn. I can't remember now why I ever wanted to write this book. For centuries, stitching has been relegated to the margins of cultural value, dismissed as a minor craft, far removed from the serious domain of art and thought. In her 1984 book, The Subversive Stitch, Rosika Parker detailed the position of this craft in relation to society. Yet the dismissal of this craft says less about the practice itself than about the gendered hierarchies that structured its reception. To stitch is to bring together what is separate, to labor with patience, and to make, or rather weave meaning from fragments. It is a practice of repair as much as of creation, and one that encodes memory, skill, and resilience in every threaded line. Now let's recall what was relegated to the spaces of oblivion. The English word text comes from the Latin textus, which is the past participle of the verb texo, texere, meaning to weave. In his 12-book work on rhetoric, and it's called Institutio Oratoria, and that was written about 95 AD, the first century Roman orator and teacher, Quintilian, uses textus and textum to describe how words must be woven together into a fine, coherent whole. He stated that after choosing words, they should be woven together into a fine and delicate fabric. Some scholars even argue that Quintilian's use of terms for text comes close to usage of word text in textual linguistics or in discourse analysis of our day. Let me then weave my text with the following thread. When reframed with respect, stitching emerges not as a trivial handiwork, but as a profound epistemology, a way of knowing and inhabiting the world that is relational, embodied, and attentive to the small yet vital connections that hold life together. While 19th century novels often feature stitching as a gendered role imposed on women, an emblem of domestic confinement and the disciplining of female subjectivity, my work takes a different direction. The 19th century fiction activities often encode women's roles, but also become metaphors for subjectivity, domesticity, and passivity masked under creativity. For example, in Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre, 1847, Jane is often depicted sewing or sketching in moments of solitude. Her sewing marks female discipline, patience, and moral seriousness. But it also underscores her restricted role, stitching as a symbol of women's confinement, while her artistic sketching signals imagination and subjectivity beyond the domestic. In Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South, 1854, Margaret Hale frequently engages in needlework. Sewing here embodies the intersection of domestic femininity and industrial upheaval, quiet labor amid social conflict. In George Eliot's Middlemarch, 1871, Dorothea Brooke's failed artistic ambitions are contrasted with women sewing needlework as acceptable feminine labor. Sewing symbolizes the narrow roles available to women. But Eliot also uses metaphor of stitching lives together to describe community and interdependence. In Louisa May Alcott's Little Women, 1868, the Marsh sisters sew both as necessity and as symbol. Beth is remembered for her sewing as part of her gentle domestic virtue. In Kate Chopin's The Awakening, 1899, Edna Pontier's resistance is marked partly by her withdrawal from domestic duties, including sewing. Needlework becomes a symbol of constraining femininity, and her refusal signals her desire for a different subjectivity. These examples show that cross-stitching and embroidery were a necessary tool that functioned to consolidate the typical Victorian division of labor. Therefore, rebelling against cross-stitching became a sign of subverting femininity as a construct imposed by various patriarchal systems. Aisha Taimur, the Egyptian poet and novelist, will always stand as a stark example of this rebellion. However, rebellion against stitching is not also my concern. I focus on stitching, cross-stitching, embroidery, sewing, any manual activity that binds the separate, reconcile the opposites, collects the fragments, and fix the torn. I focus on stitching in its variations when done voluntarily. Only then it becomes a method of weaving together scattered subjectivities amid contexts that leave no other options. This focus allows me to approach stitching not as a metaphor of constraint, but as a method of connection through which I aim to trace how dispersed subjectivities can be gathered, articulated, and made visible across different cultural and literary contexts. In these contexts, the act of stitching exceeds its function as labor or duty and transforms into a critical practice of reassembling fragmented identities, allowing for new ways of imagining collectivity across histories and geographies. Watching the horrid news in Palestine, I was shattered and bedridden like everybody. Confronted with acute helplessness, I found that writing about a Palestinian heritage and celebrating it through words was the only path left to me. My project originates in the practice of Palestinian tatreez, a textile tradition that has endured and flourished even in the face of displacement and attempted erasure. In contexts where entire communities have been subjected to systemic violence, tatreez has functioned as one of the few practices capable of countering genocide, not with weapons, but with threads that carry memory, belonging, and survival. As Wafa Ghanaim argues in Tatreez and Tea, embroidery operates simultaneously as an archive and a testimony, preserving genealogies of place and identity, even when the land itself has been taken. Each stitch is thus what Walter Minnolo calls an act of epistemic disobedience, refusing the colonial demand for silence and invisibility by insisting that cultural knowledge is preserved and transmitted through embodied material practice. Tatreez is therefore not merely ornamental, but archival and resistant. suturing together histories that otherwise risk obliteration. It is from this practice where thread becomes testimony and fabric becomes archive that I draw the central idea for this research. Stitching as a method of gathering and connecting. Stitching as a method of challenging the epistemic violence of colonial modernity. To cross-stitch the scattered becomes a method of reading and writing women's subjectivities that could remedy subjectivities long fractured by patriarchal narratives, colonial histories, and silences imposed on women's voices. Theoretically, this project situates its analysis at the intersection of cultural practice and critical theory, reading textile traditions as material forms of identity, resistance, and memory. To conceptualize the subjectivities that emerge from such practices, I begin with Stuart Hall's influential account of identity as a process of suturing. Hall contends that the subject is constituted not outside but within representation, emphasizing that identities are stitched together from fragments of history, discourse, and lived experience rather than discovered as pre-given essences. In this light, textile practices offer not only metaphors but material enactments of suturing, embodying the ways in which fractured subjectivities are gathered and mended. The practices I will engage with illuminate how textile traditions enact what Hall describes as suturing. Each example demonstrates how a fractured identity is by dictatorship, by occupation, by slavery, by racism, or colonial erasure, is stitched again into coherence through material practice. Feminist textile theory deepens this insight by foregrounding the gendered history of textile labor. Rosika Parker's The Subversive Stitch demonstrates that embroidery has historically been implicated in the making of femininity, teaching women obedience and submission, while paradoxically becoming a weapon of resistance to the constraints of femininity. Excuse me. Bell Hooks, reflecting on Black quilting traditions, reminds us that textile practices provided enslaved and marginalized women with a resource for creative imagination and cultural reconstruction. Jessica Hemmings notes that textiles carry stories of identity, gender, and memory that other forms overlook. Taken together, these insights make visible the epistemological, political, and affective dimensions of textile practices, enabling the formulation of what I term stitched subjectivities. Finally, decolonial feminism reframes these textile practices as epistemologies that resist Eurocentric hierarchies of knowledge. Maria Lugones demonstrates how coloniality imposed new gender systems that erased indigenous and non-Western practices, transforming relations of labor and embodiment. In this framework, arpileras, tatris, black quilting, and Korean bogaji emerge not as craft subordinated to art, but as counter archives of decolonial knowledge. They demonstrate how marginalized women's work sutures together histories and subjectivities fragmented by colonial and patriarchal violence, making visible alternative genealogies of survival and creativity. My theoretical framework finds expression in a range of global practices. where textiles function as archives of struggle and survival. For example, the Chilean arpileras, hand-stitched tapestries produced during the Pinochet dictatorship, documented in scraps of life and arpileras, and the symbolic use of stitching in Isabella Allende's The House of Spirits demonstrate how fabric became a textile counter-archive. In Palestine, tatreez, embroidery, functions simultaneously as cultural practice and historical text. Its motifs, such as the tree of life and the eight-pointed star, preserving continuity across generations, as traced in Wadad Qawar's Threads of Identity. In the United States, Black feminist quilting, from Harriet Power's Bible quilts and the communal work of the Gee's Bend quilters to Faith Ringgold's story quilts and the quilting metaphors in Toni Morrison's beloved, functions as a form of sutured subjectivity, reassembling fragmented histories into collective memory while imagining new methods of kinship and belonging. Patricia Turner shows how quilting in African American communities encoded secret messages, spiritual values, and communal survival, while contemporary artists like Ringgold use quilted canvases to narrate intertwined histories of race, gender, and diaspora. In South Korea, I'm not sure it's Bujagi or Bugaji. If anybody can help, please do not hesitate. Let's stick to Bujagi now, if I dare say so. In South Korea, Bujagi traditions, analyzed in Lee Kyung-ja's Bujagi, The Art of Korean Wrapping Cloths, alongside historical royal embroidery, Kim Hye-ja's contemporary installations, and the feminist aesthetics of Na Hee-suk illustrate how embodied threadwork transforms scraps into continuity and care, embodying philosophies of resilience and renewal. As Youngmin Lee argues, Bujagi represents the aesthetics of connection and care, piecing together fragments into wholeness. Now, let me begin with the Chilean arpileras. They stand as one of the most poignant instances of how textile practices transform domestic materials into political testimony and communal memory. Emerging under the Pinochet dictatorship in the 1970s and 1980s, these hand-stitched tapestries were created primarily by women, often mothers, sisters, or wives of the disappeared. Using scraps of fabric, discarded clothing, and household materials, women constructed vivid scenes of repression and survival. Soldiers patrolling the streets, queues for food, clandestine protests, and most strikingly, empty chairs symbolizing those who had vanished. The arpileras became textual bodies of testimony that bore witness to violence while circumventing state censorship, functioning simultaneously as art, political document, and survival strategy. One of the most powerful examples is La Cueca Sola, Dancing Cueca Alone, by Violeta Morales, which depicts women dancing Chile's national dance without partners, carrying portraits of their disappeared relatives across their chests. This work visualizes absence as both trauma and resistance, performing what Stuart Hall might call a suturing of fractured subjectivities. Arpileras from the Museo de la Memoria y los Derechos Humanos. Yes, this one. It similarly records scenes of hardship, hunger, and grief, with figures queuing for food, for bread, for milk, and families mourning in homes framed by the Andes Mountains. These works transform the ordinary textures of domestic life again into a political, explicit process, yet it is implicit because it is masked under creativity. More recently, exhibitions such as Arte, Mujer y Memoria, and they exhibited works from 1976 till 2019, have brought these textiles into global museum spaces, where the stitched depictions of community soup kitchens and grassroots organizing stand as counter archives of political struggle. This aesthetic of stitching memory and trauma finds a literary counterpart in the fiction of Isabel Allende, whose novels also work to reassemble fractured histories of Chile under dictatorship. In The House of the Spirits, Allende weaves a multi-generational narrative where memory, trauma, and resistance are embroidered into family history, showing how private loss and public violence are inseparably bound. Of Love and Shadows, which was published 1984, directly engages with the violence of Pinochet's regime, recounting the discovery of a mass grave and foregrounding female protagonists who, like the women who stitched arpileras, insist on making visible what the state seeks to erase. As one critic says, Allende's prose operates like an arpilera itself, layering scraps of memory, fragments of testimony, and strands of imagination into a narrative fabric that resists silence and forgetting. Palestinian Tatreez has long functioned as a visual language, a cloth archive, encoding geography, memory, and belonging. As Shelar Ware observes, before 1948, a woman's village and status could be read at a glance from her gown, as surely as from her dialect. The embroidered dress was not ornamental, but a wearable manuscript, a text legible to those who knew its codes. Wafa Ghanaim echoes this point in her memoir textile guide, Tatreez and Tea, insisting that my mother and grandmother were not only embroidering, they were writing history with needle and thread. Following the Nakba of 1948, Tatreez acquired new urgency as an act of survival. Motifs once tied to specific villages were unmoored and transformed into emblems of a lost homeland. In the words of Layla Abu Lughd, embroidery became part of the memory work of survival for displaced Palestinians, Suad Amiri provides a vivid example in Sharon and My Mother-in-Law, where she recalls how her mother insisted on wearing embroidered dresses in exile. She wore Palestine on her body, every stitch a refusal of disappearance. This resignification of embroidery resonates with Walter Minolo's concept of epistemic disobedience, the refusal to accept colonial categories of knowledge. For Palestinian women, often excluded from formal historiography, Tatriz became a counter-archive. Ghanaim notes of the embroidery circles in refugee camps. She says, in the tent, women stitched not only dresses, but also maps of return, routes back to villages now erased from the land, but alive in the thread. Without Qawar, widely known as the mother of Palestinian dress, has devoted decades to documenting and preserving this heritage. Her monumental threads of identity, preserving Palestinian costume and heritage, catalogues one of the most significant collections of Palestinian embroidery in existence. Qawar insists that every stitch tells a story, every pattern records a place. Together, they form the threads of our identity. By situating the embroidered thobe as an archive of memory and history, Qawar reveals how Palestinian women's hands preserved the nation in cloth when political archives were under attack. Her Tiraz Museum in Amman, which houses over 2,000 pieces, preserves what she calls the hidden texts of women's hands. Qawar's work thus anchors Tatriz in both scholarship and lived heritage, ensuring it is not relegated to folk art, but recognized as cultural testimony. In the diaspora, Mary Evers' Palestinian embroidery project, she's Irish, has been equally vital. A digital archive and teaching resource, it documents hundreds of traditional motifs with painstaking accuracy, making patterns and histories accessible to a global audience. Evers emphasizes that the patterns are the voices of women across generations. To lose them is to silence culture. By charting designs, village by village, she transforms the private act of stitching into a publicly accessible archive. Her work is not simply antiquarian, it functions as pedagogy as well. Evers' recent initiative that is called Stitch Their Names Together aims to remember Palestinians murdered in Gaza. All the names of those who, the names of the martyrs. The project brings together volunteers from across the world to stitch the names and ages of all the victims of Israel's genocide. In this sense, her work parallels Qawar's museum and Ghanaim's storytelling circles, but uniquely extends Tatriz into the light, into the digital sphere, democratizing access to what was once fragile, endangered knowledge. Equally significant is Shereen Husseini Shahid's memoir, Jerusalem Memories, published in 2000. A member of the distinguished Husseini family, Shahid recalls how embroidery was both intimate practice and national.
Professor Shereen, can you hear me?
You put it in the chat.
She describes that carried the
Okay.
memory of villages and seasons in every thread. For Shahid, Tatriz embodied continuity amid disposition. She says, when the land was lost, the dress became our homeland, stitched with our longing. Her testimony intertwines embroidery with domestic memory, situating Tatriz within the effective history of Jerusalem's elite families as well as the lives of refugee women, bridging private memoir and collective memory. Literary depictions reinforms this interweaving of stitch and text. In Mahmoud Darwish's embroidery in his volume Mural Gedariya, the dress becomes a manuscript. He says, on the canvas of the dress, I embroidered the map of my country. Fadwa Tuqan similarly aligns poetry with stitching. I stitched my sorrow into words as my mother stitched our fate into cloth. Raga Shahada writes of embroidered garments that spoke a language more ancient than my law books, each motif a poem of belonging. In Ghassan Kanafani's Men in the Sun, the embroidered dress functions as the last material evidence of a home now lost, crystallizing Tatriz as a mobile archive of displacement. حذامة حبايب's Velvet مخمل 2016 provides perhaps the most sustained fictional meditation on embroidery. Set in a refugee camp, the novel follows Hawa, a seamstress whose world is saturated with fabrics and stitches. Habaib describes her embroidery as the only beauty she could conjure in a place that denied her all others. Yet the novel complicates readings of Tatriz by showing it as both a means of survival and a site of confinement, a prison made of thread, as Hawa says. Hawa's stitching sustains her materially and spiritually, but it also represents the circumscribed horizons of women's labor under occupation and exile.
Oh no.
Let's move to Black quilting. Quilting within African American women's traditions occupied a critical intersection of memory, aesthetics, and feminist resistance. Much like Chilean arpileras, quilts arose from necessity, repurposing scraps into functional blankets, but evolved into intricate narratives encoding histories of survival and community. The Gee's Bend quilters of Alabama, for example, transformed discarded cloth into striking geometric forms, celebrated as some of the most miraculous works of modern art America has produced, according to the New York Times. Yet long before institutional recognition, Black women quilters stitched together fragments of memory and heritage, enacting what bell hooks call a counter-hegemonic aesthetic of survival. Literature often mirrors this practice. Alice Walker's Everyday Use, published 1973, situates the quilt as a contested site of cultural value. Dee views it as artifact. These are all pieces of dresses grandma used to wear. Did all the stitching by hand. Imagine Maggie, by contrast, sees the quilt as living tradition, memory embodied in gestures and everyday life. Toni Morrison, beloved, similarly embeds quilting into the novel's texture. Baby Suggs' patchwork quilt, pieced together from scraps of dresses, shirts, and trousers, carries the weight of fractured memory, yet binds it into provisional coherence. Poetry extends this literary stitching. Lucille Clifton's poem Quilting envisions craft as communal survival, something about the way the pieces go together. Natasha Trethewey, native Guard, recalls her grandmother's quilts as repositories of untold stories, fragments of Black domestic life, stitched into patterns that both conceal and reveal. Quilting for Clifton and Trethewey alike becomes an act of mourning, a reclamation of history, and a method of stitching fragmented identities together. Scholars have recognized quilting not only as a metaphor, but also as a method. Patricia Collins, argues that quilting represents the gathering of fragments into a collective whole, mirroring the survival strategies of Black women's communities. Elsa Barkley Brown describes quilts as alternative texts, communicating communal histories through patterned surfaces. Contemporary artist Faith Ringgold further radicalizes this subversion in her narrative story quilts, including Who is Afraid of Aunt Jemima and Tar Beach. Ringgold collapses distinctions between visual art and literature, stitching women's stories into being and reclaiming visibility for narratives often excluded from official archives. Quilting emerges as an epistemological practice, a feminist method of knowing and remembering. As Gloria Anzaldúa observes, it embodies mestiza consciousness, a negotiation of fragmented identities into survivable creative forms. Quilts gather fractured histories and silenced voices into coherent, tangible wholes, functioning simultaneously as artwork, pedagogy, and counter-archive. Just as African American women stitched together histories and identities through quilting, so too have women in other regions used textiles to assert their presence and to resist erasure. In Korea, embroidery offers a parallel practice, domestic thread work that carries memory, resilience, and subtle forms of resistance across centuries of patriarchal and colonial constraints. Well, that's the sign usually for Korea. It's a code for those who know Korea. Korean embroidery has increasingly been understood as a subtle yet powerful form of resistance within patriarchal, colonial, and class-bound contexts. During the Joseon dynasty, women of Yangban, this is the noble class, they were largely confined to domestic spaces, excluded from formal intellectual or political life. Embroidery became one of the few sanctioned forms of expression. Through stitching from a feminine duty into quiet self-assertion, Hong Yun-hee interprets these artifacts as silent autobiographies and vernacular epistemologies. Confucian ideals reduced embroidery to signs of virtue and obedience. Yet many pieces exceeded decoration, embedding symbols of independence, longevity, or transformation, like butterflies, phoenixes. The needle became a pen, a way to speak from within silence. During the Japanese colonial rule, embroidery assumed an anti-colonial dimension, maintaining traditional bujagi patterns became acts of cultural survival, embedding national symbols in domestic textiles. Scholars like Yun-hee and Kim Jung-hee frame these works as counter-archives, preserving knowledge suppressed by colonial modernity. By the late 20th century, bujagi evolved into metaphors of resilience. Chungi Lee's contemporary installations, these ones, use stitch remnants to render visible fractured identities and divided families, embodying historical rupture. Korean feminist scholars reclaim embroidery as a radical aesthetic practice, repositioning dismissed women's work as art, archive, and critique. The layered Jukabo patchwork is read as a metaphor for fragmented female subjectivity, stitched into coherence by women. Korean literature amplifies these themes. Park Wan-soo's memoir, Who Ate Up All the Shinga, recounts her mother's relentless sewing. With a needle in her hand, my mother patched our lives back together. Every stitch was a refusal to give up. Sewing becomes another testimony, a poetics of repair, a method of gathering the torn amid war, poverty, and social upheaval. I cannot end this without mentioning Arab women. In Arab women's writings, textiles function as both craft and knowledge-making. Fatima Mernis's memoir, Dreams of Trespass, set in 1940s Fez, portrays embroidery as a subtle language of rebellion within the patriarchal harem. Women wove their rebellions into the fabric of the everyday. Motifs encode desire, memory, and aspiration, a hidden transcript, as Scott has said, preserving dissent excluded from formal histories. This aligns again with Minolo's concept of epistemic disobedience, subaltern knowledge produced through thread and motif. Guha al-Harthi's celestial bodies, Sayyidat al-Qamar, similarly foreground sewing as resistance and expression. Maya, coerced into an arranged marriage, finds refuge in dressmaking. Her fingers flew over the fabric, stitching her silence into every dress. Here, sewing functions as textual labor, inscriptions of suppressed emotion, fragments of life ignored by official discourse. Domestic labor becomes cultural testimony, a poetic of repair, gathering desire, memory, and autonomy into patterned continuity. This is Guha al-Harsi in the middle, is from Sultanate Oman. In bringing these scattered narratives together, we see how women's creative labor unsettles dominant literary genealogies and offers alternative epistemologies rooted in material practices and communal experience, only to highlight Widad Qawar's view with each needle and thread. Palestinian women inscribed their villages, their memories, and their resistance, turning fabric into a living map of a homeland under siege. Cross-stitching, then, becomes more than a metaphor. As Alice Walker said earlier, even when they could not write, they stitched their dreams into quilts, piecing together scraps of cloth as they pieced together the remnants of their own histories. It is a critical method that binds fragmented stories into a shared fabric of resistance, revealing women's literary subjectivities not as peripheral, but as central to the ongoing work of decolonizing knowledge and reimagining the possibilities of narrative itself. Thank you, and may your thread never break.
Thank you so much, Professor Shereen Abouelnaga, for this compelling talk. Can you hear me clearly?
Thank you.
You can hear me?
I think
Okay, because we're having
long
technical
time.
difficulties with Zoom. I'm glad you can hear me clearly.
I hear you, yes, I hear you.
Great, thank you. Now we have about 15 minutes for Q&A. We can take questions from the attendees in the room, but also from Zoom World. Are there any questions that you have about this illuminating and very compelling talk on cross-stitching?
I have a question.
Of course.
Can you hear me? Can you hear?
Yes.
Okay, you can hear the audience? Great.
Okay.
We have a question from Sila.
So with Palestinian Alta trees, do they still today stick with the symbols that with their village, or are they? Is it more open-ended now? Do you happen to know?
Could you repeat her question, please? For the women in Palestine today, are they still
using the same symbology for their villages, or is it more open to, like, do they share their symbols?
Of course, there is a common ground among all, but then each area, you know, they have their own, it has its own dialect and they have their own symbols. But all this is documented and archived by Widad Qawar, for example, by Wafa Ghanaim, and many other people, to the extent that the museum in Amman, that is called Tiraz, is just devoted for this. It is a place made especially for this, because for them, this is heritage. This is heritage, which means it's history. So yes, yes. No, it's not open for, no, it's not open. They know their own history, you know, and they know the codes, they know the symbols. It's not, in other words, it's not haphazard. Yeah.
Do we have any other questions from folks in the room? Or, of course, we welcome questions from folks in the chat. Dr. Naveen, I'm not sure if you have access to them.
Yes, I have access. And actually, we have a question from Maha and Saeed. You can open the mic, Maha, and ask your question.
Professor Shereen, thank you very much. Thank you very much for a most interesting and enlightening presentation and paper. I think it's really it's I find it fascinating, and I just wanted to share with you that to me it unsettles a lot of the stereotypes. Like when we talk about crafts and we talk about stitching, I usually get onto this side of you're stereotyping women. You're keeping women in a trap of what is feminine, what women should be doing. But with your presentation today, you really unsettle this stereotype. You unsettle and you show a feminist way of resistance that is very important, that should not be overlooked. And I thank you deeply for that. Thank you. Thank you, Professor Shireen.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. So guys, do you think it's worth it if I extend this into a book? I mean, there are other practices all over the world, and I want to focus on, the global south. Sorry, I reversed the roles. I'm asking now the audience.
This is great. An
I-
interactive session is fantastic.
Yeah.
We have here a comment from
Noreen.
Yeah.
So I was just wondering if Dr. Shereen has looked at Hmong story cloths as another form of embroidery and textile use.
So, Professor Shereen, could you hear that?
No. Sorry.
So
Could
you're
you
wondering
repeat
if-
the question?
Hmong story.
So, have you considered looking at Hmong story cloths as a kind of extension, like to look at the parallels and reciprocities between these different kinds of embodied practices?
Which stories? Which stories?
Hmong story cloths.
HMONG.
So HMONG. MG.
Okay.
It might
Now,
be-
that's an idea. I'll look at it. Yeah. You're opening for me the horizon. You're
Can I
opening the
also-
horizon for more. Yes, of course. Go ahead.
Professor Shereen, actually, I have a comment that is also connected to a question, but thank you so much for this talk. I couldn't help but think of Sedu weaving in the Arabian Peninsula and also parts of the Levant, like with the Bedouin community. So think of Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, like all of these Gulf countries where Bedouin women, so, to emphasize the gender roles, so Bedouin women weave these Sedu patterns, and till this day we have them, of course. And now they're more, you can see them hung ornamentally in houses, but of course, as your talk illuminated, it's a spiritual practice, cultural practice, a very embodied practice that carries on the heritage of the region. So I see the parallel there. And I also see today we are here, in Wisconsin on, you made parallels with Chile, with Black women, but also the indigenous community. So I'm thinking of Diné or Navajo weavings, but also the ho-chunk basket making. So here from cross-stitching, I see a parallel to basket making where the ho-chunk community would make baskets out of wood, particularly black ash wood. So I see these global South connections there. And this is, it's absolutely, like, in my humble opinion, worth pursuing.
I see your point, and I like your idea very much. I mean, of course, the Bedouins, of course, they do that. I'm wearing one of them. Look at that. Can you see it now?
Great.
This
Yes,
is made
we
by
can.
Bedouins. Yeah. So I want just to focus on this practice when it becomes a means of producing knowledge. See, because my theoretical framework is about decoloniality. So when this craft becomes a means of subverting, unsettling, giving voice to all that has been silenced, that's why I focused on Chile, Palestine, of course, Korea. And while researching Korea, I discovered something in China. They discovered that women invented a long time ago a certain language that is called Nushu, because women were not allowed to get any education, so they invented a language to communicate. And this is like a recent discovery. So I'm looking at this practice. On the outside, it's creativity. It involves labor. It might be taken as a sign of domesticity, yet it carries something else. It is a method of decolonizing knowledge, restoring the indigenous knowledge that were completely buried or demolished. And sometimes these are tools of the political struggle, like what happened in Chile. See? So I'll keep researching, and whenever I find that this text, this craft has become a means of subverting the status quo, I'll definitely look at it. Yeah.
That's wonderful.
Yeah.
Do we have any more questions?
Maybe I have a quick question. Thank you very much, Shereen. It was a very, very interesting, enlightening topic and talk for sure. Thank you very much for your presentation. Yeah, actually, I'm wondering how can one try to understand the practice of stitching and embroidery and tattries and quilting as a way of counter archiving and so on and so forth, when at the same time it can be manipulated, right? It can be used as a labor and figure and a sign of domesticity, because also, I mean, it has been very much used, commercialized. There's a lot of businesses going on through it, and it's through it and beyond it even, and using it as just a commercial token. So how can we try to navigate this kind of challenging, spaces where it's on one hand it is after all sometimes looked at as something that needs a lot of labor, patience, time consuming, used as a business, as a consuming tool, and at the same time it could be a counter revolutionary act.
Of course. Yeah. I think your question is very important. We need to trace the origin of this craft. So if we look at Chile, for example, those women started stitching the arpileras out of necessity. They wanted money. But at the same time, they decided that they are going to send political messages. They are turning this into, archive, metaphorically. And this continued, by the way, for 2 decades, and that's a long time. perhaps now it's turned into something commercial, but we have to bear this in mind. You know, when, what was her name? The American critic who wrote Sisterhood is Power, the one who wrote this big anthology in the 90s. Sisterhood is powerful, and in sisterhood we unite, and all that. That was a lot. She made a lot of noise in the US. Anyway, in 2003, believe it or not, uh, Christian Dior used Sisterhood is Powerful as a slogan, as a quote on one of the sweaters. You know, it became a Christian Dior thing. See, while that was a heated political controversy between in the American scene in the 80s and the 90s, it was a heated controversy. No, sisterhood is not powerful. You have to endorse our demands as Black women. No, we're not going to unite with you. It was a heated controversy. It ended up as just a slogan on Christian Dior's sweater. So we have to be careful, because this is neoliberalism. It just commercializes anything. It turns anything into, you know, a folkloric piece. See, so you empty the thing from its message. It becomes just something empty, nothing but empty. See.
Yeah,
But
thank you.
we
I
have
think
to
it's,
pay attention to
is
that.
it Robin Morgan, the feminist?
Robin
Yeah,
Morgan,
Robin
thank you
Morgan.
very much. Yes, thank you. Well, at least I remembered her family name. Yeah, yes, Robin Morgan. Yeah, yeah. So yeah, we have to pay attention to that. I mean, when you say navigate, the moment you said navigate, I was thinking, well, navigating means researching. See, this is research. This is why we have to do research. Yeah.
Mhm. Thank you. Thank you very much, Shereen. I think we are almost, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank
thank you
you
very
for
much.
this. And,
We are
yeah,
here at
and let's meet in
1:13.
April.
Please.
Yeah.
Hanan, would you like to say something? Go ahead.
I
Sorry.
would just like to say thank you so much again for this compelling, provocative talk about cross-stitching and its connection to the status quo. You know, it led us to think about gender roles, labor exploitation, and that tension between subversion or possible reproduction of power. So thank you for that. And I'd like to thank Professor Shereen Abouelnaga again for honoring us with her presence. And thank you to Dr. Naveen as well for joining us today and introducing the talk and moderating the Q&A on Zoom as we had technical difficulties. Thank you to the audience in Zoom and also the audience here. We appreciate your presence. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks all. Bye-bye.